Imagine you're sitting across this massive polished oak negotiating table in Geneva. You know, you are a seasoned diplomat.
Right, a real professional.
Exactly. And your goal is to stop a brutal escalating war. So you come armed with all the standard tools of modern statecraft.
Like trade deals, border concessions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, trade deals, billions in economic aid ready to deploy. You lay all this out, and you're expecting a totally rational calculation from the other side.
Because that's how we're taught the world works, right?
But the person sitting across from you, they aren't looking at a map of borders. They're looking at a cosmic battleground between God and Satan.
Wow. Yeah, that changes the math completely.
So how do you negotiate a ceasefire with someone who fundamentally believes that, compromising with you is a literal sin?
I mean, you can't. Not with the secular toolkit anyway.
Right.
And that disconnect, that gap between a Western diplomat trying to optimize like a geopolitical spreadsheet and an adversary fighting a holy war.
Yeah.
Well, that might be the single most dangerous blind spot in global politics today.
It's terrifying when you really think about it.
It is. We operate on this assumption that nations act as rational economic agents, but history and human psychology, they tell a much darker, much more complex story.
And that profound disconnect is the mission for today's deep dive. Welcome in, everyone. We are unpacking a highly provocative panel discussion today.
Yeah, it's from the Dutch festival Duverheffing.
Right, which translates roughly to the elevation. And this panel brought together three prominent thinkers. We've got Adverbrugge, Christian Alting von Gussau, and Gewerboris.
And we are going to explore their core premise, which asks a really deeply unsettling question.
Which is?
Is the West fighting an illusion of a clean, logical, secular war, while our adversaries and even some factions within our own borders are actually fighting a spiritual and cultural one?
It's a huge question. But before we dive into the actual mechanics of their arguments, we really need to establish some ground rules for how we're approaching this text today.
Definitely, because the source material we are unpacking, it wades into incredibly sensitive territory.
Yeah, it really does.
I mean, these thinkers are making strong, sometimes super controversial historical and philosophical claims. They're talking about major world religions, specific historical figures, and, highly charged modern geopolitical conflicts.
Absolutely. So for you listening right now, we just want to be crystal clear. Our role today is to be your impartial guides through this material.
We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We're going to break down the anatomy of the arguments presented by this panel without taking sides. We're not endorsing their specific viewpoints, and we are not passing judgment on the religious or political doctrines they discuss.
Right. We're just here to understand how these thinkers arrive at their conclusions and what those conclusions actually mean for how we interpret the world.
So with that framework in place, where do we start?
Well, to understand why modern conflicts are so misunderstood, we actually have to go backward, like way backward.
How far are we talking?
We have to look at the architectural foundation of how the West has justified state violence for the last 1,000 years. So the panel starts by examining Thomas Aquinas and the Christian just war theory.
Ah, yes, the just war theory, which is basically the bedrock of our modern understanding of acceptable warfare, right?
Exactly. But it's often misunderstood today.
See, I always thought of the just war theory as like a sort of permission slip for medieval kings to just go conquer things.
Right, that's the common perception. But the panel emphasizes that the baseline principle for Aquinas and for Christian theology at the time was that war is fundamentally inherently evil.
Wait, really? The baseline is that it's evil?
Yes, it is not a neutral tool of statecraft. It's viewed as a catastrophic failure of human morality.
Oh, wow. I feel like that essential starting point completely gets lost in modern translations of the theory.
It does. Biblically, state-sanctioned killing is an aberration. But, Aquinas was a pragmatist as much as he was a theologian.
Okay, so he's looking at the real world.
Exactly. He looked around at the 13th century and realized, hey, humanity operates in a deeply flawed, hyper-violent reality.
Yeah, total pacifism might be the divine ideal. But if a neighboring kingdom just marches in to slaughter your citizens, turning the other cheek results in total annihilation.
Right. So Aquinas developed this framework where, under highly restrictive, agonizingly specific conditions, a war might be considered a necessary evil, a justified war.
Okay, let's unpack this checklist he made. He gave us the 3 specific hurdles a leader had to clear, right?
Yeah, 3 hurdles. First up, The war must be declared by a legitimate authority.
Meaning like a recognized state or sovereign.
Exactly. You couldn't just have a wealthy baron or like some rogue warlord raising an army because they wanted more sheep or land.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second hurdle?
Second, there had to be a justified cause. You couldn't fight for glory or expansion. It had to be a direct response to a grievous wrong.
So self-defense being the classic, most airtight example of that.
Spot on. Self-defense is the gold standard there.
Okay, and the third condition?
The third one is the psychological one, and honestly, it proves to be the most problematic. It's called right intention.
Right intention. What does that actually mean in practice?
Aquinas argued that even if you are attacked, and even if you are a legitimate king, your internal motivation for fighting back must be pure.
Pure how?
You must be fighting solely to restore peace and justice. If you're fighting to exact brutal vengeance or to plunder the enemy's gold.
Or just out of deep-seated hatred for the opposing population.
Exactly. If any of that is your motive, the war immediately ceases to be just, even if it started as self-defense.
Man, it's a fascinating attempt to, legislate the human soul during wartime.
It really is. And the panel points out that this purely theological framework didn't just stay trapped in the Middle Ages.
Right. It evolved.
Yeah. A Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius came along later, looked at Aquinas' religious rulebook, and essentially stripped the explicit theology right out of it.
He secularized it.
Yes. He secularized it. Grotius's work literally became the foundation for modern international law.
So, the United Nations charters, the Geneva Conventions.
All of it. The rules of engagement we expect modern secular nations to follow today are basically just secularized medieval Catholic theology.
That is wild to think about. But it seems like it works reasonably well in theory, right? Until you introduce, I don't know, modern technology into the mix.
Oh, absolutely. The source material highlights a massive disruption to this centuries-old framework.
They mentioned something about a recent pope, right? Pope Leo?
Yeah, referred to in the text as Pope Leo. He apparently convened a special consistory.
Which is essentially a high-level formal gathering of the Pope's top cardinals, right?
Right. And he convened them to ask a really radical question. He asked, does the just war theory even function anymore?
The Church itself is actively questioning if Aquinas' rules are obsolete.
Yes. And the culprit for that obsolescence is the sheer weaponization of modern science.
Because Aquinas was writing in an era where violence was incredibly intimate.
Exactly. He had to look a man in the eye, feel the physical resistance of his armor,
And exert massive physical calories just to swing a broadsword. Violence was localized and limited by just the sheer exhaustion of the human body.
Compare that visceral, bloody reality to the sterile nature of modern combat. The panel brings in this concept from the philosopher Gunther Anders, which captures this perfectly.
What's the concept?
He calls it the obsolescence of humanity, or in the original Dutch phrasing from the panel, die antiquering van de mens.
The obsolescence of humanity.
Huh.
Anders developed this idea in the shadow of the atomic bomb, didn't he?
He did. His argument is that the sheer destructive scale of nuclear weapons and now automated drone warfare, it vastly outstrips our emotional and moral capacity to even comprehend the damage we are doing.
So we have acquired the technological software to annihilate our entire species, but we're still running on the moral hardware of a medieval village.
That's a perfect way to put it.
I mean, think about it. When a drone operator sits in an air-conditioned command center in Nevada, drinks a coffee, and clicks a mouse.
And vaporizes a target, plus inevitably collateral civilians thousands of miles away in another hemisphere.
Yeah. The classical moral calculus just completely breaks down. The disproportionate power makes the idea of a just war seem almost absurd.
The distance, both physical and psychological, it totally neutralizes the moral weight of tucking a life.
It's just a screen and a button.
Right. Anders argues that humanity has engineered a destructive capability so vast that we are no longer truly participating in war as human beings. We are just operators of an apocalyptic machine.
You cannot apply a 13th century theological test of right intention to an intercontinental ballistic missile.
No, you really can't. The weapon itself implies indiscriminate annihilation, and that fundamentally violates Aquinas' requirements for proportionate response and the protection of the innocent.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. I look at this three-step checklist: legitimate authority, justified cause, right intention, and I can't help but think it functions exactly like a strict corporate contract.
How do you mean?
Well, if the baseline rule is thou shalt not kill, doesn't giving political leaders a three-step checklist Just guarantee that they will hire the geopolitical equivalent of expensive corporate lawyers to find loopholes in that contract.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
Like if you tell a leader, you can't go to war unless you claim self-defense, aren't they just going to manufacture a scenario that looks exactly like self-defense?
Your corporate lawyer analogy actually exposes the fatal flaw in this whole medieval compromise.
Right.
Because if the core requirement for a justified war is having the right intention, who exactly is auditing that intention?
Nobody.
Exactly. The panel explicitly addresses this exact skepticism. They argue that the highly subjective nature of good intentions actually makes the just war theory incredibly dangerous.
And to understand why it's so dangerous, the panel takes us back to the early days of Christianity.
They do. Before Aquinas tried to build this compromise, the early Christians and later radical Reformation groups like the Anabaptists, they took a totally different approach.
They were just radically, uncompromisingly pacifist.
Totally. They looked at the teachings of the New Testament and took them completely literally.
Their theological logic was that they belonged entirely to the kingdom of God, which is a spiritual realm of perfect peace.
Right, and they viewed the kingdoms of the world with their borders, their armies, their politics as inherently corrupt and completely separate from divine law.
Because they belonged to God's kingdom, they utterly refused to participate in the violence of the worldly kingdom.
Yes. They wouldn't serve in the military, they wouldn't swear oaths of allegiance to kings, and they wouldn't hold political office.
Because holding office inevitably required the use of coercive force.
Which is incredibly intellectually consistent. If your core tenet is peace, you absolutely refuse to fight.
But the panelist, Govert Boogis, points out the massive practical wall this ideology hits.
The wall of reality. Radical pacifism essentially makes statecraft impossible.
Because if you're a leader and you adopt total pacifism, you can't have a police force to stop a murderer.
Nope. You cannot have a standing army to repel an invasion. You can't even enforce basic laws, because laws ultimately rely on the threat of state violence for compliance.
So extreme pacifism pushes a society dangerously close to anarchism.
Precisely. If the state cannot protect its citizens from internal chaos or external predators, the state collapses.
So the mainstream historical churches, guided by thinkers like Augustine earlier on than Aquinas, and later reformers like Luther and Calvin, they realized they were trapped.
They had to somehow merge the utopian of perfection of the kingdom of God with the messy, violent, pragmatic reality of governing actual human beings.
And that unbearable tension is what birthed the just war compromise.
Yes. But as you mentioned, who audits the intentions? The panel uses this brilliant Dutch metaphor for this dilemma.
Oh, I love this part. What was it?
They say it's like the butcher grating his own meat.
The butcher grating his own meat is the ultimate psychological blind spot.
It really is. The requirement is that a leader must be fighting for a noble cause, like self-defense. But there is no independent, objective testing facility for geopolitical motives.
No polygraph test for kings.
Exactly. Every single aggressor in human history has claimed that God, or righteousness, or historical necessity was on their side.
The panel points directly to modern conflicts to illustrate this. Like, look at Vladimir Putin's rhetoric surrounding the invasion of Ukraine.
It's a perfect modern example.
Regardless of how the international community views it, Putin does not stand at a podium and say, we are aggressively conquering a neighboring sovereign state for territorial gain and resources.
No, the rhetoric is entirely defensive. It is framed as a necessary preemptive strike against an existential threat from NATO.
A defense of ethnic Russians, and a literal crusade against Western corruption.
And the scary part is, this isn't just cynical propaganda. It often stems from a genuine psychological delusion of power.
Leaders internalize their own grand narratives.
Yes. They grade their own meat and declare it prime quality. When a nation evaluates its own actions, the internal echo chamber will always, without fail, find a way to justify violence as a noble defensive necessity.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener, as you try to make sense of the news today?
It's a tough pill to swallow.
If every aggressor genuinely believes they are the victim acting in self-defense, is international law just a polite fiction?
Are the United Nations and the Geneva Conventions just like decorative wallpaper we put up to hide the raw, territorial brutality of human nature?
The panel seems to imply that these secular frameworks are well-meaning attempts to civilize something that is inherently barbaric.
But because the testing of intent is entirely internal and self-serving, these laws are incredibly fragile.
A framework designed to limit war can easily be hijacked and used as the legal justification for war by the very people it was meant to restrain.
Exactly. But the fascinating thing about history is that people didn't just give up when the just war theory failed to stop conflicts from starting.
Right. If they couldn't stop leaders from finding loopholes to start wars, the historical Christian church tried a totally different tactic.
They tried to create highly specific rules for how you fight once the war has already begun.
And the source text brings up a massive grassroots social movement from the Middle Ages that I had literally never heard of, and it is absolutely mind-blowing.
You are referring to the Peace of God movement and its later evolution, the Truce of God.
Yes. When did this happen?
This started around the late 10th and early 11th centuries, so roughly around 1000 to 1100 AD.
Okay. And to understand how radical this was, we really have to paint a picture of daily life in feudal Europe for the listener.
Oh, it was an absolute nightmare. There was no centralized state, no strong national king to keep the peace anywhere.
Power is hyper-localized. Europe is completely carved up by local warlords, barons, and castle lords who are engaged in this state of perpetual, miserable, low-level warfare.
They're constantly raiding each other's lands, burning each other's crops, and slaughtering peasants over petty territorial disputes.
The common people are just living in a constant state of terror and starvation because of this endless feudal violence.
It was bleak, and the monasteries and the local clergy were utterly appalled by this.
But they faced a massive logistical problem.
Right. The church didn't have a standing army to go fight these barons, so they utilized the only weapon they had at their disposal.
Immense moral and spiritual authority.
Exactly. The panel details how these monks began organizing what we would today call massive citizen panels or grassroots assemblies.
Picture this. Unarmed monks go out into the countryside and rally the terrified, mud-covered peasants.
They gather a massive crowd, they carry the holy relics of saints out of the churches, and they summon the local, heavily armed, hyper-violent warlord to a literal town hall meeting in an open field.
And they use the shared grand narrative of their faith to leash the warlord.
They would look at this baron and say, "You claim to be a Christian. Sunday is the day of the Lord's resurrection. It is deeply sacrilegious to shed human blood on the day of resurrection.
You must swear an oath on these holy relics to completely cease fighting from Saturday night to Monday morning."
And the staggering part is, it worked.
Wait, it actually worked.
It did. The sheer societal pressure of thousands of peasants, combined with the spiritual threat of excommunication, it forced these warlords to agree. They actually stopped killing each other on Sundays.
That is incredible.
They
But the monks didn't stop there, did they?
No, once they got Sunday, they got strategic, they pushed the boundary. A few years later, they convened another council and said, well, Saturday was the day Jesus lay in the tomb. It's a holy day of profound mourning.
You can't fight on Saturdays either.
Right. And the barons, trapped by their own professed belief system, agreed again.
Why?
Then the church came back and said, Friday is the day of the crucifixion. It is an insult to the cross to wage war on a Friday, no fighting on Fridays.
And they kept going. Furthermore, Thursday was claimed as the day of the Last Supper.
Through this relentless, incremental moral pressure, this movement managed to drastically restrict the official combat window of the Middle Ages.
According to the source material, by the time the Truce of God was fully implemented in certain regions, the acceptable time for feudal warfare was essentially squeezed down to Monday morning through Wednesday evening.
It's hard to even fathom.
I mean, think about the logistics of that. It's almost like setting an out-of-office auto-reply, but for a medieval siege.
An out-of-office for war. I love that.
Imagine being a warlord, your trebuchets are loaded, your men are on the ladders, and the sun starts setting on Wednesday. Sorry, lads, I am currently out of the battlefield until Monday at 9 a.m. Please direct all arrows to my voicemail.
The visual of an army pausing a siege because the clock struck midnight is incredibly surreal to modern ears, but it highlights a monumental shift in human history.
How so?
The panel points out that this was one of the first massive, organized attempts at the humanization of war. The monks knew they didn't have the power to abolish war entirely. Human nature was just too violent.
But they believed they could contain it, put a fence around it, and limit the damage.
And they didn't just limit the days, they limited the targets. The Peace of God introduced strict rules forbidding attacks on women, children, the elderly, clergy, and unarmed peasants.
They essentially laid the very first cultural bricks for the modern concept of non-combatant immunity.
Exactly. Unarmed people used their shared belief system to force heavily armed aristocrats to spare civilian lives.
It is a profound testament to the power of a dominant cultural narrative to alter human behavior.
It is. But, I have to temper that idealism, and so does the panel, because we have to grapple with the darkest contradiction of this era.
What's the contradiction?
The very same religious institution that successfully orchestrated the peace of God to limit violence inside Europe eventually turned around and used that exact same moral authority to launch one of the most infamous, bloody, and expansive military campaigns in human history.
The Crusades.
Yes, the Crusades.
And that pivot from peacemakers to holy warriors brings us to a highly charged segment of the panel's discussion.
It does. They delve deeply into the historical narratives surrounding the major world religions, specifically contrasting the origins of Christianity and Islam, and how the Enlightenment period later framed these conflicts.
And again, to you listening, it is crucial to remember we are strictly summarizing the historical interpretations and arguments presented by the panels themselves here. We're acting as neutral reporters of their claims.
Right. So the panelist Christian Alting von Gussau makes a very sharp distinction based on his reading of the historical origins of both faiths.
His argument rests on the precedent set by the founders, right?
Exactly. He frames Jesus of Nazareth as fundamentally a man of peace, a figure who submitted to state violence rather than wielding it.
Okay.
In contrast, he characterizes the Prophet Muhammad as a figure who was not only a spiritual leader, but also a military commander and head of state who engaged in warfare to establish and protect his community.
Von Gussau takes this origin difference and extrapolates it into a broader structural claim.
He does. He argues that Christianity, at its theological core, offers itself in freedom, meaning it functions primarily as a belief system one opts into, distinct from the civil government.
Conversely, he characterizes Islam not merely as a private religion, but as a comprehensive juridical, political, and social system, a totalizing structure that historically aimed for societal dominance and governance.
And when the inevitable counterargument is raised, when people point to the Crusades as the ultimate proof that Christianity is just as inherently violent and conquest-driven,
What does he say?
the panelist aggressively pushes back against the modern historical consensus. He argues that the Crusades are falsely portrayed in our modern education system purely as unprovoked, aggressive religious wars of European conquest.
Instead, he attempts to radically recontextualize them.
Yes, he frames the Crusades primarily as a delayed political and military response to over 600 years of prior Islamic territorial expansion.
He points out that the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of the Mediterranean were heavily Christianized regions for centuries before being conquered by expanding Islamic empires.
Therefore, in his view, the Crusades were less about theological fanaticism and more about geopolitics. A defensive, albeit brutal, attempt to reclaim lost territory and secure pilgrimage routes.
It is a defense that tries to shift the motivation from purely religious zealotry to standard human territoriality.
But the panel goes even further in dismantling our standard historical narrative. The panelist, Govert Bouilles, steps in to discuss the broader, uglier reality of human violence across all cultures.
What's his take?
He argues that humanity is simply inherently a violent species, and we give religion entirely too much credit or blame for that violence.
He said some pretty crazy data on this, doesn't he?
He does. He cites data suggesting that if you catalog roughly 3,000 major historical conflicts throughout recorded history, only about 10% of them can actually be classified as genuinely religious wars.
Wow, that statistic is meant to be a shock to the system. 10%.
If 90% of all wars have nothing to do with religion, it leads to a massive critique of a period in history that the West generally reveres.
The Enlightenment.
Exactly. The panel argues that the entire concept of the wars of religion, referring to the horrific continent-spanning conflicts like the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, is actually a framing mechanism.
A framing mechanism invented by Enlightenment thinkers, specifically to discredit religion.
If you look at the political motives of the Enlightenment, this historical PR campaign makes perfect sense.
Thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries wanted to break the political stranglehold of the church, elevate secular reason, and build modern nation-states.
And what better way to achieve that than to look at the smoldering rubble of Europe and tell the populace, look at what religion did to you.
Religion is inherently violent, irrational, and dangerous. If you want peace, We must completely separate church and state and give all the power to the secular government.
It was a brilliant political maneuver, but the panelists argue it is a severe distortion of actual history.
They point out that incredibly bloody conflicts, like the Hundred Years' War, which happened long before the Protestant Reformation even existed, had absolutely nothing to do with theology.
Right. Nobody was fighting over the interpretation of the Eucharist. It was a brutal, generations-long dynastic family feud over land and resources between the descendants of Charlemagne.
The panel also brings in the research of modern theologian William Cavanaugh to support this.
Kavanaugh looked deeply into those supposedly purely religious conflicts, like the Catholic-Protestant wars of the 16th century.
And what did he find?
He found that beneath the simplistic narrative of Catholics killing Protestants over theology, there was a massive web of shifting political alliances.
There were continuous peace initiatives and treaties being undertaken by members of opposing faiths who realized their economic and political interests aligned better with each other than with their co-religionists.
The reality on the ground was raw power politics, not a holy war.
This highlights a deeper sociological point the panel makes about what happens when a pure ideology becomes institutionalized.
Yes. When a spiritual movement becomes a state, when it acquires vast tracts of land, massive wealth, armies, and worldly power, it inevitably starts playing worldly power politics.
But because it is a religious institution, it disguises those secular political ambitions in the language of theology.
The panelist makes a really striking historical observation to back this up. He argues that the loss of the papal states in the 19th century,
When the Catholic Church lost almost all of its sovereign territory and worldly political power in Italy.
right, he argues that was arguably the best thing that ever happened to the institution.
Because stripped of the burden of running a state, fighting border wars, and managing economies, the Church was forced to relinquish worldly power and return to its primary spiritual and moral core.
The text uses King Henry VIII of England as the ultimate example of this institutional hypocrisy.
Oh, Henry VIII. He initiated a massive religious schism, broke England away from the Pope in Rome, and founded the Church of England.
But does anyone seriously believe Henry had a profound theological awakening about papal authority?
Of course not. As the panel notes, the root cause was intensely personal and political. He desperately wanted a divorce to secure a male heir, which the Pope wouldn't grant for political reasons.
Furthermore, Henry wanted absolute political autonomy and, crucially, access to the immense wealth and land held by the Catholic monasteries in England.
The theology of the Reformation was just the incredibly convenient wrapper for a massive secular power grab.
So the historical reality, according to this panel, is that religion is far more frequently instrumentalized by political actors to achieve secular goals, rather than religion itself being the primary driver of the violence.
But wait, let me push back on that framework a little bit.
Go for it.
If we completely remove religion from the equation of human history, as Govert Buches and the panel suggests we should when analyzing conflict, they imply we would just find another excuse to kill each other. So is religion just the most convenient, most easily tailored costume for basic human territoriality? If we didn't have holy texts and gods, wouldn't we just fight over flags or economic theories or which sports team we support with the exact same level of brutality?
That is exactly where the discussion has to go next, and you've hit on the core psychological mechanism.
Okay, good.
If religion is just a costume, why do we need to wear a costume at all? The source text dives incredibly deeply into the psychology of killing, exploring exactly why humans cannot simply commit violence as themselves.
They require a psychological disguise to mask the horror of what they're doing.
And this exploration of human psychology is easily the most revealing part of the discussion.
To understand the costume, the panel starts with the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes had a famously bleak, cynical view of human nature.
Very bleak. He argued that humans in their natural state are inherently afraid of one another. Because I don't know if you were going to try to steal my resources or attack my family, my most mathematically logical move to ensure my survival is to attack you first.
This preemptive fear leads to what Hobbes famously called the war of all against all.
But the panel contrasts Hobbes's philosophical theory with modern anthropology and psychological research. And the reality is much more complicated and arguably more tragic.
Anthropologically speaking, killing another human being, especially at close range, is not a natural instinct.
It's deeply, viscerally repugnant to the human psyche. We have an immense biological and psychological barrier against taking a human life.
It requires a massive override of our natural empathy.
So we have a paradox. If killing is so deeply repugnant and psychologically damaging to the individual, how do we explain the thousands of years of endless, massive human warfare?
The panel argues that to overcome this innate biological resistance, humans absolutely require what they call a grand narrative.
A grand narrative.
You need a story that is vastly bigger, more important, and more noble than your own individual conscience.
You need a narrative that reframes the act of murder into an act of salvation or necessity.
Exactly. That story could be the will of God. It could be the glory of the fatherland. It could be the promise of a communist utopia where all class struggle ends.
But you need something transcendent to justify the unthinkable.
The panel points out that ancient cultures understood this psychological barrier intimately. Look at ancient Sparta.
What do they do?
They used extreme, brutal rituals to systematically break down the individual empathy of young men and force them over this psychological barrier, molding them into weapons for the state.
Other cultures used altered states, right? Warriors would consume hallucinogenic drugs, brew ancient potions, or engage in frantic rhythmic dancing for hours to achieve a state of trance.
Yes, they had to achieve a state of mind where their individual identity dissolved, allowing them to commit acts of violence they could never commit while sober and self-aware.
What all these methods share is the concept of de-individuation. War requires rituals. It requires matching uniforms, marching in synchronized step, and purification rites.
And why is that? Because these rituals mask the individual. They strip away your personal identity, your personal morality, and your personal agency.
They transfer the moral burden of the violent act from you, the individual person, to the institution or the grand narrative you serve.
As the panel points out, a soldier fighting for a cause kills, but an individual without a cause murders. The uniform fundamentally alters the moral nature of the act in the mind of the perpetrator.
The source text uses the historical example of the Knights Templar to illustrate this.
Oh, that's a great example. These were heavily armored, highly trained killers who were also sworn monks.
How did a monk justify hacking a man to pieces with a sword?
By deeply de-individuating themselves. They didn't see themselves as individual men committing acts of violence for personal gain.
They viewed themselves purely as servants or hollow instruments of God's will. If God commands the strike, the moral responsibility belongs to the divine, not to the man holding the weapon.
And this psychological reality leads the panel to one of their most provocative arguments.
What's that?
They argue that when it comes to analyzing human violence and extremism, the mechanism of radicalization matters infinitely more than the actual content of the ideology.
To prove this, the source draws a direct, striking parallel between two vastly different modern groups, the Red Army faction, the RAF, and Al-Qaeda.
Think about those two groups. On paper, their ideologies are polar opposites.
Right. The RAF was a militant group in West Germany in the 1970s. They were strictly secular, atheist, and driven by Marxist dialectical materialism.
The theory that all of human history is driven by the conflict of economic classes, and that a violent revolution is necessary to achieve a classless utopia.
Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, is a deeply religious, fundamentalist Islamic terrorist network fighting for a global caliphate based on divine law.
The content of their grand narratives couldn't be more different, but the panel argues that the psychological pipeline that creates a terrorist for either group is virtually identical.
Both groups recruit the exact same demographic. Lost, alienated, often educated youth who feel disconnected from mainstream society and are desperately searching for meaning.
They're looking for a larger narrative to belong to. The radicalization process, the isolation from family, the stripping away of the individual ego, the total devotion to the cause that suddenly justifies horrific violence.
It operates on the exact same psychological hardware. The grand narrative, whether it's Marx or religion, is just a plug-and-play variable in the machinery of radicalization.
The narrative is just the crowbar used to pry open the psychological barrier to violence.
But the source text cites a fascinating insight from a Dutch general, Dick Berlin, which exposes just how fragile these grand narratives actually are when tested by reality.
What did General Berlin say?
He notes that in the actual terrifying heat of combat, when the artillery starts falling, the dirt is flying, and the chaos descends, the grand ideology completely evaporates.
It vanishes instantly. When you are pinned down in a trench, you aren't thinking about the intricacies of dialectical materialism.
You aren't contemplating the historical destiny of the fatherland, and you aren't debating theology.
No, you are fighting purely for the physical survival of the comrades to your left and your right. You are fighting to keep your friends alive.
The grand narrative is the psychological mechanism required to get a peaceful human being onto the battlefield. But the raw biological human connection is the only thing that sustains them once they are there.
It really makes me think of putting on a superhero mask or a supervillain mask.
Like Batman.
Yes, like Batman. When Bruce Wayne is in a tailored suit, he is bound by the laws of high society. But when he puts on the Batman cowl, he is de-individuated.
He becomes a symbol, an instrument of justice, and suddenly he is allowed to inflict severe physical violence that Bruce Wayne could never ethically justify.
The grand narrative is that psychological mask. It turns a horrific act into a heroic one, allowing a normal person to bypass their ingrained moral programming.
Yeah, but there is a profound dark side to that mask analogy.
Wow.
Because once the mask is on, the institution controls you, not your own conscience.
You surrender your moral agency to the narrative.
And this brings us to the final, and undoubtedly the most chilling, conclusion of the source material. Because the masks we are wearing today, as a global society, are shifting.
The panel warns that the West is fundamentally misinterpreting the masks our adversaries are wearing, meaning we might not realize what kind of war we are currently fighting.
The panel takes a wide-angle historical look at the 20th century to explain this shift.
They argue that during the 1900s, traditional Orthodox religion largely faded from the geopolitical stage in the West.
But crucially, the human need for a grand narrative to justify state action did not go away. Nature abhors a vacuum.
So we replaced God with massive secular political ideologies.
We replaced religion with communism, fascism, and Nazism.
Now, on paper, these were secular materialist political systems, but the panelists astutely observed that they functioned psychologically with the exact same sacral religious intensity as the faiths they replaced.
They weren't just political parties, they were substitute religions.
Think about it. They had their own sacred texts, like Das Kapital or Mein Kampf.
They had their own infallible prophets and god kings, like Stalin, Hitler, Mao.
They had strict purity rituals, they purged heretics who deviated from party doctrine, and they demanded absolute, unquestioning faith in a promised land.
Whether that was a classless global utopia or a racially pure thousand-year Reich, they required the exact same de-individuation and sacrifice as any ancient cult.
But the panel argues that the era of those massive pseudo-secular ideologies is largely over.
And as that secular tide recedes, we are now witnessing the dramatic return of actual overt religion as a primary motivating force for global conflict.
The old gods haven't died. They are back on the battlefield dictating state policy.
And the panelists provide several stark contemporary examples from around the world to illustrate this massive shift back to spiritual frameworks.
Starting in the United States, they point to the rise of what is often called Christian nationalism or Christian integralism.
This is a growing movement among certain evangelical and conservative Catholic factions that explicitly reject the classic Enlightenment divide between church and state.
They actively seek to merge the two, arguing that civil laws must be subordinated to or directly reflect a specific interpretation of divine law.
Moving to the Middle East, they highlight Israel, noting the increasing tangible influence of ultra-Orthodox Judaism not just in cultural life, but directly in state affairs, military policy, and territorial claims.
Then they look at Iran, which is perhaps the clearest example of a modern state built entirely on a theological framework.
They note the deep Shia cultural elevation of martyrdom, and specifically how the Iranian Revolutionary Guard frames their geopolitical conflict with the West.
When Iran's leaders speak, they do not just call the West a political adversary or a competitor for oil. They frame Western materialism, Western secularism, and Western cultural exports as the Great Satan.
That is the key distinction right there. Calling a nation the Great Satan is a cosmic, spiritual categorization.
It elevates a disagreement over foreign policy into a literal battle against absolute metaphysical evil.
And perhaps most tellingly for the current geopolitical crisis, they look at Russia.
The panel highlights how the Russian Orthodox Church, specifically under leadership, closely allied with the state, has actively participated in framing the brutal war in Ukraine.
This conflict is not being sold to the Russian public merely as a geopolitical border dispute, or a defensive pushback against NATO expansion, or a fight over grain exports.
According to the panel's analysis, it is being explicitly framed from the pulpit as a literal spiritual war against the Western Baal.
And Baal is an ancient biblical Canaanite god historically associated with idolatry, child sacrifice, and absolute moral corruption.
The rhetoric weaponizes the West's progressive social values. The panelists specifically point out issues like transgender rights and shifting gender norms as undeniable proof of a profound Western moral decay.
The war is framed as a holy crusade to stop the spiritual infection of traditional righteous civilization by Western demonic forces.
If we synthesize the grand thesis of this panel, it leads to a terrifying conclusion about the state of the world.
The West is operating under a massive, potentially fatal delusion.
We sit in our diplomatic suites in Geneva, New York, or Brussels, and we genuinely believe we are fighting logical, secular, neutral wars.
We think we're arguing over policy differences, democratic norms, trade routes, and spheres of influence.
But our adversaries, and as the panel noted, even some growing ideological factions internally, do not view these conflicts through a secular lens at all.
They view them as profound, cosmic spiritual wars against absolute evil.
And that brings us right back to our opening scenario. This creates a fundamental, incredibly dangerous disconnect in global diplomacy today.
Think about the massive implications. What happens when a secular diplomat, armed with rational choice theory, economic sanctions, and proposals for border demilitarization, tries to negotiate a peace settlement with an opponent who genuinely, deeply believes they are fighting a literal, divine war instructed by God?
It's an impossible conversation. You cannot bargain over the price of a ceasefire with someone who believes that compromising with you is a sin that will condemn their soul.
The secular negotiator is looking at a map, trying to split the difference and find a middle ground where everyone gets a little bit of what they want.
But the spiritual warrior isn't trying to split the difference. They're trying to cleanse the earth of corruption. They aren't just speaking different languages. They are inhabiting entirely different, mutually exclusive realities.
For you listening right now, I really want you to think about how you consume global news.
When a new conflict breaks out or an old one escalates, we have been trained by our secular education to immediately look for the hidden economic motives.
We look for the historical border disputes, the access to ports, the geopolitical strategy. We assume someone is trying to make money or gain territory.
But what if we're applying a sterile 20th century secular lens to a messy 21st century spiritual war?
What if the geopolitical chessboard we think we're analyzing is actually an altar?
It forces us to reevaluate every headline, every speech by a foreign leader, and every failed diplomatic summit.
It demands that we start taking the theological and psychological narratives driving human behavior seriously, rather than just dismissing them as cynical propaganda hiding the real economic motives.
Sometimes the religious rhetoric isn't the costume, it's the actual engine driving the machine.
We have covered a massive amount of intellectual ground today, jumping across centuries of history and psychology.
We started with Thomas Aquinas trying to fit the square peg of a just war into the round hole of Christian morality.
And how modern technology, the terrifying, indiscriminate power of nuclear weapons and drone strikes, has likely rendered that classical moral framework totally obsolete.
We explored that incredible grassroots history of the medieval monks in the Peace of God movement, using sheer moral authority to force heavily armed warlords to take the weekend off from killing.
A flawed but beautiful early attempt at the humanization of war.
We pushed back against the Enlightenment's PR campaign that tried to blame all historical conflict on religion.
We noted that whether it was dynastic family feuds over land or massive secular ideologies, humans have always found a way to justify violence.
We dove into the dark psychology of the grand narrative, that psychological mask that strips away our individual conscience, de-individuates us, and allows a normal person to overcome their innate biological repugnance to killing.
Whether that mask is radical Marxist materialism or fundamentalist religion.
And finally, we arrived at the chilling realization that the 21st century might be witnessing the massive return of spiritual warfare to the global stage,
where the West's secular diplomacy is completely mismatched against adversaries who believe they're fighting cosmic battles of good and evil.
It's all up to process.
It is. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds on everything we've unpacked from this panel, but pushes the implications one step further.
I am intrigued.
We discussed how humans desperately need a grand narrative to justify state violence, and how secular ideologies like communism and fascism simply stepped in to fill that exact psychological void when traditional religion faded in the 20th century.
Right.
Here's the question I want you to think about. If our modern nationalism, our political ideologies, and our secular states require the exact same rituals, the same blind faith, the same de-individuation and the same willingness to sacrifice human life as ancient religions did, is humanity actually capable of building a truly secular society?
Wow.
Or are we simply hardwired, biologically and psychologically, to eventually worship whatever it is we are willing to kill for?
That is a profound question.
Yeah.
It suggests that the line we draw between the sacred and the secular might be nothing more than a comforting illusion.
Just a story we created just to make ourselves feel more civilized and evolved than our ancestors.
It really does. Next time you look at a map of a modern conflict zone, remember it might look like a chessboard, but the pieces might be moving to a totally different unseen rhythm.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you a powerful, albeit complex, new lens through which to view the world, cutting through the noise and giving you the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.